It's my pleasure to be here. I'm very much looking forward to learning from you all because we are a diverse group of scholars, clinicians, practitioners, and my own background has inspired this paper in some ways. As you mentioned, I did a master's degree and then worked for a number of years as a practitioner. I worked in humanitarian assistance and also in diplomacy. So this paper that I've written is now returning to academia, to academic research, but as much as I think we all in this room are supportive of holistic, integrative efforts, I think it is also important that we stop and we consider how we're going to achieve this holistic effort. So this paper is what I call a bridging conversation, to take some time to share with you some of the developments in my field of research, and then also to take stock of some of the other things that have been found, and seeing if we can find ways that we can weave together our efforts, even as we will continue to have different goals, different perspectives, and different methodologies. So as you mentioned, I am actually doing a dual PhD. So one of my PhDs is in anthropology and the other one is in conflict studies. So this paper, I'm seeking to approach this topic of trauma from anthropology and from conflict studies. What this allows us to do is not just to look at some of the analytic and academic insights that we've had, such as the concept of embodied trauma, which I can talk about, but also I think to look at some of the conflict literature. This can be particularly helpful. As I said, I was a practitioner in justifying trauma intervention at an early level to situations that are often overwhelmed with need. On the other side, I've often had to justify programmatic dollars on almost everything we were doing, so I think drawing from some of this conflict literature can be helpful for us to know. And then also I wanted to just touch on trauma, which your presentation also mentioned trauma as it has impacted individuals, as it impacts society, and as it continues throughout generations. So the challenge with a short presentation like this is should you consider one topic in depth or should you consider the top level overview of the whole paper? I'm going to opt to do this latter to give you just a very broad overview of what my paper discusses. I'm happy to share the paper, the scholars, the resources that I used if any of these topics are interested and helpful for what you're doing. So just to begin, I found in my career, both as a diplomat and a humanitarian actor, that it's really important that we stop and we consider exactly what we're defining as trauma. So I've already heard this mentioned at our conference. So just to hold my own feet to this challenge, I just want to clarify that I'm using this perspective, drawing heavily from Valent, of trauma as distinguished from stress. So we have stress as a strain. A strain is different in the body as a strain from a bone fracture. And so he says that with stress, while stress can be resolved, prior equilibriums can be restored, trauma disrupts life-enhancing balances. He says specifically trauma is the area where attempts to restore life-enhancing equilibria have failed. It is an area of struggle, of compromise, and of creating ways of finding new balance and healing. So this is where I'm pulling from. And in this first section of my paper, I look at some of the academic efforts that have been undertaken to look at trauma from an interdisciplinary or holistic effort. I highlight Kermayer et al. They look at trauma from biological, clinical, and cultural experts. There's another volume that's come out from the psychiatrist Devin Hinton and the anthropologist Alexander Hinton, and they've looked at traumas of genocide and mass killing from their respective disciplinary lenses. I found also Golden and Berger's edited volume very interesting. What they do is they approach trauma with a zoomed out snapshot of various approaches. This includes clinical, anthropological, historical, psychoanalytical, and philosophical, while also seeking to include foundational ideas from well-known academic thinkers including Foucault and Freud. So I wanted to add to this conversation a debate that is occurring particularly within American anthropology. There's something now which is being called integrated anthropology. So I'm trained in American anthropology. We look at the discipline through 4 subfields. We have biological, we have cultural, sociocultural, and we have linguistic, and we have archaeological emphasis on the material remains of past societies in this context. So what a lot of anthropologists are beginning to discuss is that if you're looking at something such as human evolution, it really becomes a sort of artificial divide in our field to look at it only as a biologist perspective or this and that. And so what one of my professors, and who's kind of spearheading this effort, is looking at integrated anthropology. So given this breadth of embedded subtopics, it's the centrality of distinctive sociological, social, semiotic, and cognitive processes. And I think this perspective may help us as we're looking at an integrated view of trauma. It'll enable us, I think, to keep our methodological rigor in our own disciplines and in our own practices and efforts, while also finding ways we can come together. What this actually means is that you're looking at behavior at the biological and the cultural intersection. one of the topics that's come out of here, which I find particularly helpful, is the topic of niche construction. Niche construction is how organisms modify their environments. But they modify both the living and the non-living components of environments in ways that are metabolic, sociological, and behavioral, and through their choices. What this simply means is that people are influencing their environment even as the environment is influencing them. Sure. So what this means is that people are influencing their environments as the environment also influences them. What this also means is that the environment is changing in a series of time. It's non-static. And so as this happens, it becomes sort of an exponential effect over time. I think this is an interesting way of looking at trauma. So as we're pulling from this integrated anthropological approach, I would also put some of the works that I highlight in my paper on memory, symptom, and recovery is also ripe for this perspective. There's some things that have come out from these topics of study. One of these is embodied trauma. So to put this simply, it's how do you carry trauma around in your body and your mind? As I have said, it's this intersection of biological and cultural, because something is usually 100% nurture or 100% nature. It's really happening at this intersection and this non-always moving intersection of both. So we might look also at some topics called idioms of distress. This is simply put how people can share in universal behaviors in culturally specific ways, in cultural symptoms, and in locally contextualized methods for coping. I wish I had more time to go into these things, but they're in my paper if you'd find some of these things helpful. As I move really quickly, because I am cognizant of the time, I wanted to highlight, or at least highlight, that these can be found in my paper, some of the large and lingering effects of conflict in societies. I'm switching gears here to looking at how we can justify trauma interventions at the earliest stages. My own background, I worked in food security research for 6 years, and one of the things that when you're working in these very serious environments, there's the donor agencies even are often overwhelmed with need. But the challenge is that these mental health programs can often be put off, like first we must take care of the physical needs. The challenge, while this makes some sense, the challenge is that the impacts of the programs are often most helpful the earlier they are implemented. So how can we begin to look at justifying the lingering effects of large-scale violence? This, I think I may just refer you to my paper, but there's economic impacts of conflict. This includes the destruction of infrastructure. This includes the diversification of productive assets to violence. This includes the reduction of the nation's economic growth. One number which is quite striking is that they have found that civil wars that last 5 years reduce growth by 2%. And this is a particularly sobering statistic because most wars are much longer than 5 years. There's also, of course, the human cost of conflict. This is the most, I think, morally stirring one. The death tolls and the targeting of civilians are particularly sobering. One way that I found helpful to make a different argument for death tolls is using something called disability-adjusted life years. This includes the number of years of productive time that people would have had on this earth that are reduced in some way, either through death or through disability. What the scholars who use terms like this have found is that they looked in 1999 alone, 8.4 million disability-adjusted life years were lost as a result of conflict. And so you can see that this, again, using this frame of niche construction, is influencing the environment. We've now lost this productive assets to society, and it continues over time. There's also social tolls, which I won't go into here, and political instability. Post-conflict countries are often found to be perceived, at least, as the most corrupt. And so because of this, there's challenges with investing in these societies. So to move along, I want to look too at this negative potentialities of unaddressed trauma as it relates to these statistics that I've shared with you. I think it's important to combine this research on exactly how far-reaching the impacts of conflict are with the fact that many people would say that untreated trauma will not just resolve on its own. So we can't really push these things off too far. I wanted to share with you one study which I looked at, which is Prib et al., and they tracked long-term mental health outcomes in 264 former Yugoslavian residents who now reside in Croatia, Serbia, Germany, and the United Kingdom. And they had all suffered from the clinical term of PTSD and yet had not received treatment. The research team presented results showing that 84% of participants were diagnosed with still having PTSD 10 years later. And when they averaged in care costs for long-term care of untreated trauma, it exceeded more than 1,000 euros per person. And so again, as we're looking at some of these long-term impacts of conflict, we can't just push trauma aside as people can kind of deal or grip with it. I don't have time here for the risk of this presentation, but to continue to fuse this with conflict research, we can also look at the political risk of both exclusion and the role that research shows this plays in conflict recurrence. And then also, you've mentioned it, I believe, but the co-opting of political narratives. Some of the work that I've done in Rwanda looks at historical instances of violence over 50 years and past instances of trauma and high-scale violence. And the question becomes, if there were some ways for dealing with some of these historical instances of violence, would the population have been as susceptible to participating? We see in Rwanda that perhaps up to 250,000 people participated. So these questions linger. So again, I'm happy to make this paper available to anyone interested in these topics or to discuss it further, but I'll stop for now.
Thanks very much, Kristina.